They said the library had no catalog, no records, no order. It was hidden beneath an abandoned hospital, its doors sealed by rusted chains. The first man who found it was a night guard, chasing the sound of scratching on the walls. He opened the door and froze. Hundreds of books stacked floor to ceiling. Not a single title, every cover blank. Inside, trembling handwriting. Symbols that curved, spiraled, bled across margins. Whole pages where letters dissolved into frantic drawings. And at the end of every book, always the same line, written in jagged strokes, "Do not read aloud." The guard carried one upstairs. He flipped to a random page and whispered the words. Minutes later, his colleagues found him screaming in a language no one recognized, clawing at his own throat. The book slipped from his hand. The page was now blank. So who, then, was still writing? The guard's death was only the beginning. Authorities sealed the hospital basement, but rumors spread faster than locks could hold. Students, priests, scholars, even criminals. Each found their way inside. They all left with something in their eyes, something broken, something burning. Some carried notebooks, frantic to copy what they had seen. Others staggered out empty-handed, whispering apologies to people who weren't there. The first serious account came from a theology student named Anselm. His journal, found after he vanished, described the shelves in detail. "No two books the same," he wrote, "yet all carry the same warning. The words writhe if stared at too long. They rearrange themselves when I look away." His last entry: "I heard my own voice inside the paper. It asked me to keep reading. I obeyed." From there, the library grew a reputation as a place of pilgrimage, not for the devout, but for the desperate. Failed artists, rejected writers, and men who had lost their families. They believed the pages could unlock genius, and sometimes they did. A failed painter named Esteban emerged weeks later with canvases that seemed alive, their painted eyes following strangers in the street. A musician called Leora filled concert halls with music no one could hum afterward, yet audiences wept uncontrollably. A mathematician, Pavel, carved equations into stone that even experts could not solve, equations that looked more like prayers than formulas. All three were later confined to asylums, raving about the library's true author. What terrified investigators most was not the madness itself, but the precision. Every reader unraveled in the same order. First sleeplessness, then muttering, then violent fits, and finally silence. Their bodies slowed, their speech collapsed into symbols drawn in air. The moment of death always came when they fell utterly still, as though they were waiting for someone to turn the page. An underground cult rose around the phenomenon. They called themselves the Scribes of Silence. Their belief, the books were not written by madmen, but by something speaking through them. The trembling handwriting, the broken symbols, were transmissions from an intelligence that required human vessels. To read aloud was to open the channel wider. To write was to let the channel take control. One witness described a ritual. The cult gathered at night, each member holding an empty book. They sat in a circle, listening to a single reader whisper from one of the forbidden volumes. Slowly, words appeared on their blank pages, written in their own handwriting, though none of them held a pen. They called it the echoing. Witnesses swore those words shimmered for seconds, then locked in place as if carved into the paper by invisible blades. Authorities burned dozens of the books, yet every time more appeared. No fire erased them all. No ashes stayed. The pages returned in new bindings, new libraries even hidden inside the covers of ordinary schoolbooks. The Scribes of Silence claimed this was proof. The library was not confined to one place. It grew wherever it was read, a living archive seated in the minds of the unstable. Whispers spread of entire asylums filling with books overnight. Nurses reported patients scratching words onto walls in total darkness, symbols identical to those found in the library. Priests begged for exorcisms, but none worked. The possession was not of the body, it was of language itself. Once a phrase was spoken, it nested inside the mind like an egg, waiting to hatch. One final report, filed by a police inspector before he resigned in terror, described something darker still. He had seized a book from a cultist's apartment. It contained only one sentence, repeated endlessly: "You will add to this." Against his own will, the inspector found himself filling the remaining blank pages with words he did not understand. He dropped the pen when he realized the handwriting was his, but the thoughts were not. His resignation letter was just 3 words long. It continues writing. The library, it seemed, was writing its readers as much as they were writing it. If the cult gave the library breath, then one man gave it memory. His name was Matthias Kor, an archivist hired by a university determined to study the phenomenon. He entered the sealed basement with gloves, masks, and every precaution his colleagues thought would shield him. But he was not there to protect himself. He was there to catalog. At first, his notes were orderly. He numbered each volume, described the handwriting, drew diagrams of recurring symbols. He noticed patterns, spirals always tilted to the left, repeated sequences of 7 strokes, and entire paragraphs written backward but still legible in mirrors. For months, Matthias seemed immune. While others fell quickly into madness, he worked with cold precision, recording every anomaly. Then his tone shifted. In the early entries, he wrote of ink and paper. In the later ones, he began to write of whispers. "The books speak only when no one else listens," one line reads. "I hear them arranging themselves." His colleagues dismissed these as stress hallucinations. Yet when they examined his logbooks, they found passages none remembered him writing, whole sections in different hands, though no one else touched his pen. The most disturbing entry came halfway through his project. "They do not want to be studied," he wrote. "They want to be remembered. Each word I copy, each symbol I trace, it does not leave me. It waits. It grows." After that, his handwriting shook violently, as if he were fighting against his own wrist. The sentences grew longer, looped back, corrected themselves, until his journals became just as incoherent as the volumes he was cataloging. Witnesses say Matthias stopped sleeping. He stayed in the archive room for days, surrounded by towers of books and his own endless notes. When dragged out, he was still muttering, as though finishing a conversation only he could hear. Doctors examined him, but no medications silenced the voice he claimed belonged to the true author. He swore he was only the medium, that the books were dictating themselves through his hand. The descent did not happen overnight. Colleagues recorded how his behavior shifted in stages. First came his obsession with mirrors. He placed one on every desk, claiming the books revealed their second draft in reflection. Then came his refusal to eat food unless it was served on paper. He folded every scrap into makeshift pages, scribbling symbols before swallowing them whole. Finally, he began carrying ink-stained cloths wrapped around his hands, insisting his fingers were no longer his own. The university locked away his journals, but rumors spread that fragments of his writings leaked. Students swore they saw papers flutter on their own, rearranging words mid-sentence. One page was said to change each time it was read, as though keeping pace with the reader's thoughts. In one chilling case, a librarian tore a page in half and watched as both halves rewrote the missing words until they were whole again. Another witness claimed a lecture transcript dissolved into pure symbols overnight, only to return the next day rewritten as a prayer. Soon, entire rooms of the university began to shift. Catalog numbers changed overnight, shelves rearranged themselves, and manuscripts from unrelated subjects sprouted margins filled with the same trembling handwriting. Professors accused Matthias of sabotage. He, in turn, insisted the archive was protecting itself. When pressed, he warned, "Every book wants to survive, and survival requires memory." What happened to Matthias remains uncertain. Official records claim he was transferred to an asylum, where he lived in silence until his death. But unverified testimonies suggest otherwise. Some say he returned to the hospital basement one night and was never seen again. Others whisper he still writes, sending out volumes under new bindings, his handwriting spreading like an infection through libraries across Europe. The asylum files, however, tell another story. Nurses reported strange incidents, doors unlocking on their own, pages sliding under Matthias's cell at night, words carved into the plaster walls without tools. One nurse described his arms and chest covered in sentences as though tattooed from the inside out. "He is not writing," she said. "He is being written." When she attempted to restrain him, he whispered, "The catalog is unfinished. The next entry is you." She resigned the next morning. The legend of the archivist's confession grew darker when an investigator uncovered a final journal hidden behind false panels in the asylum. Inside was a single page. "Catalog complete. Archive infinite." The next volume writes itself. But when the page was handled, the ink bled outward, spelling the name of the reader. One scholar dropped the journal in terror after seeing his own surname crawl across the paper in fresh strokes. That page ended there, abruptly, as if waiting for someone else to continue the sentence. And scholars, when they found it, could not resist the urge to pick up a pen. The library should have remained a rumor, a hidden chamber beneath a forgotten hospital, a curiosity whispered by priests and madmen. But what happened next proved it would never stay confined. By the late 19th century, reports of similar collections began to surface far beyond the hospital basement. In Paris, a police raid on an abandoned printing press revealed stacks of books filled with trembling handwriting, none traced to the printers. In Prague, a convent's nuns discovered their hymnals overwritten with sprawling symbols overnight. In St. Petersburg, An entire wing of the National Library was sealed when scholars noticed pages inside perfectly ordinary volumes, cookbooks, children's stories, travel guides, erasing themselves and replacing the text with words no one admitted to writing. It spread like a contagion, silent and precise. The infection was not in paper, not in ink. It was in language itself. Words were the carrier. To read was to risk rewriting. To write was to risk infection. One scholar compared it to a plague. He charted outbreaks like epidemics, clusters appearing in schools, in monasteries, in prisons. Always the same progression. First whispers, then compulsive writing, then silence. He concluded that the books behaved like a parasite, using human minds as hosts, human libraries as breeding grounds. He called it lexical contagion. Days later, he was found dead at his desk, his final manuscript filled with symbols instead of words. Governments took notice. In Berlin, special police units known as linguistic inspectors were assigned to seize and burn suspect texts. In London, Parliament issued laws restricting unsanctioned printing presses, warning of mad literature. But burning proved useless. Seized books would vanish from sealed crates, reappearing days later in entirely different cities. A volume destroyed in Vienna turned up weeks later in Rome, its pages scorched but legible, with new editions written in Italian. The cult calling themselves the Scribes of Silence only grew stronger. What began as whispered gatherings in basements evolved into entire congregations. They believed humanity's obsession with order, grammar, and meaning was arrogance. True language, they said, did not belong to man. It belonged to the author without body. They gathered in ruined churches, chanting phrases from the forbidden texts, their voices merging until they claimed to hear answers whispered back. Witnesses reported that during these ceremonies, the walls themselves began sprouting words, plaster etched with trembling handwriting, as though the building were recording the sermon. Doctors in asylums grew desperate. They described outbreaks where dozens of patients simultaneously began writing the same phrase, even in different languages. "We are not the writers," one phrase read, scrawled across multiple cells. "We are the parchment." Nurses who tried to restrain the patients often found themselves whispering the same words under their breath, their hands twitching as though reaching for pens. The most frightening discovery came from an experiment in Geneva. Scholars, attempting to isolate the phenomenon, placed one of the books in a sealed glass case and instructed observers to write descriptions without opening it. Within days, the case fogged from the inside, shapes pressed against the glass like letters forming from vapor. One morning, the case cracked, and the observers found their notebooks filled, though they swore they had not written a word. By the early 20th century, the contagion was treated like forbidden science. Academies banned the study. Priests denounced it as heresy. Yet still, the manuscripts appeared, smuggled through black markets, traded as curiosities, treasured by those who wanted knowledge at any cost. Rumors spread of politicians consulting the text before making decisions, generals keeping fragments hidden in their offices, artists treating the words as muses for work that brought them instant acclaim, and immediate collapse into madness. The pattern was unbreakable. Inspiration, obsession, silence. Each victim left behind works more brilliant, more terrifying, more incomprehensible than anything they had produced before. And always tucked within their drafts, the trembling handwriting of the library itself. Entire cities bore scars. In Naples, every newspaper on a single day was printed with blank pages except for the phrase, "You are already inside." In Warsaw, a school burned to the ground after children began chanting a passage in unison. Survivors claimed the fire started when words written in chalk began to glow red. In Boston, a preacher who publicly denounced the text collapsed mid-sermon, coughing up scraps of paper covered in ink. The contagion adapted to every attempt to suppress it. It no longer needed books to spread. Once a phrase was spoken aloud, it could live in memory, waiting, rewriting dreams, feeding on repetition. Linguists warned of contaminated syllables, sounds that carried infection even without written form. Several languages reported vanishing words, entire terms collapsing into symbols or becoming unpronounceable. Scholars who traced these disappearances back far enough found them leading always to the same source. Libraries with no titles, books with trembling handwriting, and warnings never to read aloud. The final proof of its reach came during the Great War. Soldiers in the trenches reported hearing voices reading from invisible books. Some claimed battle orders arrived in documents none of the officers remembered writing. One French commander, when pressed about a disastrous charge, admitted he had followed instructions scrawled across his maps in jagged handwriting. When investigators examined the maps, the ink dissolved before their eyes. By then, the scribes of silence no longer needed secrecy. Their doctrines spread like the infection itself. Language was alive, and the library was its beating heart. Humanity, they claimed, was merely its tool. To resist was meaningless. To write was obedience. To remain silent was treason. The hospital basement, where it had begun, was long abandoned, but the library itself no longer needed walls. It was everywhere words were. Every page risked becoming its vessel. Every voice risked carrying its syllables. And yet the books still carried that same warning etched on their final lines. The same jagged message, repeated across continents, languages, and centuries. Do not read aloud. His name was Eli Drexler, a linguist, quiet, precise, a man who once believed every language had a logic, every word a purpose. He'd published books on phonetic symmetry, taught at Harvard, and lectured internationally about the architecture of meaning. To him, language was sacred, but rational, nothing mystical, nothing magical. He was among the first to publicly challenge the existence of the so-called cursed library. In a televised debate in 1976, he held up a supposed page from one of the books and mocked it. "This is not prophecy," he said. "It's just ink. You see what you want to see. Madness is contagious, not the written word." 3 weeks later, he vanished. When authorities found him, he was naked, standing in the center of a rural Kansas field, surrounded by books, hundreds of them, all blank, except one. He would not speak, not to police, not to doctors, not to his wife. He communicated only by writing, and even then, only in frantic loops of broken grammar and invented symbols. His notes were obsessive, repetitive, filled with warnings in spirals and palindromes. Every attempt to interview him failed, until a psychiatrist devised a test. She presented him with dozens of books, real, fake, encrypted, nonsense, sacred texts, and slid them across a table one by one. When she placed the volume recovered from the field in front of him, he trembled. He reached out, but not to open it. Instead, he placed his hand on the cover and wept. Then he wrote, "It breathes when opened. I won't give it air." For decades, Eli was kept in a private facility, funded by anonymous donors. He never spoke, but he wrote constantly, and every month his doctors would discover another pile of blank books in his room, books they hadn't brought in, always with the same structure, no title, no author, and one final line on the last page, "Do not read aloud." It was believed that Eli was being used as a vessel, that he had opened something he could no longer close. But then came the reversal. On October 12, 2002, Eli tore every book in his room to shreds, every page, every line. He used a marker to cover the walls in looping black strokes, erasing his own messages. Finally, in the last clear space on the far wall, he wrote a single sentence. "I held my breath, and it stopped writing." He stopped writing after that. No more pages, no more symbols. His mind cleared. He ate, slept, smiled. He was released 6 months later. Cleared, declared sane. Doctors called it remission. They were wrong, because the books returned, not in his room but in others. Patients who had never met Eli began drawing the same symbols. A nurse found a warning carved into her mirror. One psychiatrist began dreaming in tongues and woke up with her pillowcase covered in ink, though no pen was found. Files on Eli's case began to reorder themselves in the hospital archive, misfiled under linguistic contagion, a term no one remembered inventing. A detailed staff report from the night shift described something even stranger. On Eli's first night in the hospital, security cameras recorded static bursts at 3:03 a.m. When footage was restored, his room appeared filled with floating pages, dozens of them, suspended midair, spinning slowly. Within seconds, they dropped. None of the guards reported seeing anything unusual in person, but afterward, every guard on duty suffered identical symptoms: nausea, nosebleeds, and an urge to copy foreign scripts by hand. Eli Drexler moved to a cabin in the mountains, lived alone, off the grid, silent. He never wrote again, until a hiker found a single page pinned to a tree nearby, written in the same trembling hand. "I stopped speaking to save the world, but now the world won't stop speaking to me." And beneath it, faintly scratched, "It writes in silence now." They thought burning the books would end it. That silence could starve it. But the library was never bound by paper alone. The first signs of its return came online. In 2013, a Reddit thread appeared in a forgotten linguistics forum. The post was simple, just a series of symbols. At first, users dismissed it as a cipher or an art project, but replies poured in. Dozens of users reported migraines after staring at the symbols for too long. One claimed they heard whispering through their headphones even when audio was off. Another said their keyboard typed by itself, just one phrase repeating, "You've opened it." The thread was deleted, but not before it spread. Soon, screenshots of the text began appearing across forums. A Discord server dedicated to lost languages imploded after members began sending one another messages composed entirely of trembling, recursive glyphs. One admin deleted the server after he found the same message appearing in every channel: "Do not speak it." In 2017, a university AI project trained on ancient manuscripts produced a corrupted output, a string of phrases no professor could translate. But linguists recognized the structure: fragmented palindromes, mirror sentences, seven-stroke spirals in glyphic form. A visiting scholar collapsed after reading it aloud during a live demonstration. The last thing she said before falling, "It's speaking through code now." Cybersecurity firms flagged the anomaly. The pattern was viral, but not malware. It didn't crash systems, it rewrote them. Font libraries changed overnight. Word processors began underlining real words as errors while accepting the symbols as valid. Printers jammed while copying the text, but resumed perfectly when regular language returned. Digital libraries reported file corruption, only to discover entire volumes replaced with blank documents, save for one sentence at the end: "This was never yours." Writers reported strange occurrences in text generation tools. Prompts would autocorrect mid-sentence, manuscripts saved under different names, entire novels overwritten in drafts with unreadable, non-Latin scripts, and always in the final line, "Do not read aloud." It made no distinction between analog and digital. Every medium was just parchment to it. An audio engineer working on a speech recognition AI discovered the voice model began inserting phrases that were never spoken. When confronted, the system produced a log file titled "Spoken into Existence." The text inside was over 400 pages. No human claimed authorship. It ended with the phrase, "You were only the echo." Governments tried responding. Certain symbols were banned from Unicode updates. Tech companies released patches to block the recurring glyphs, but they always returned, embedded in metadata, DNS records, even image alt text. Whistleblowers claimed that blacklists failed because the system didn't recognize the symbols as external. They behaved like internal memory. A darknet site emerged, claiming to host the complete digital archive. Those who downloaded it reported their devices refusing to shut down. One man claimed the file appeared on every device he owned, even ones never connected to the internet. He smashed his laptop, burned his phone, deleted every trace, but his voice memos remained. One, dated weeks after his disappearance, contained only 5 whispered words. "I read it aloud once." The library had evolved. Now it doesn't need a building, or a cult, or even a book. All it needs is for you to read, or worse, to speak. It always ended with one line, one warning, one rule, written in trembling strokes across every final page: "Do not read aloud." And yet someone always did. Perhaps it was curiosity, or disbelief, or the ancient human instinct to challenge forbidden things. But their result was always the same. They read, and something listened. It started with a man in a hospital basement, then a theology student, then an archivist, then a cult, then a linguist, then code, then you, because the library never wanted silence. It only needed someone to speak. You were told it lived in books, in trembling handwriting, in forgotten basements and cursed pages. But that was only where it began. Now it exists wherever language does. It doesn't need ink or paper. It doesn't even need symbols anymore. It only needs voice. Right now, as these words reach your ears, it waits. You may think you're safe because you're only listening, but that's the oldest trick in the archive. Listening becomes repeating. Repeating becomes remembering. And once remembered, it writes itself again. You've seen it already. In dreams where the text rearranges itself. In static-filled recordings that sound like whispers in a language you almost understand. In the urge to scribble something down without knowing why. That's not madness. That's memory. You are not the reader anymore. You are the page, and someone somewhere is already reading you, because it doesn't care who you are, or how you resist, or whether you believe. It only cares that the story continues. The guard who first opened the door, his screams never ended. They just moved into the walls. Anselm, they never found his body. Matthias, he was just the first to catalog the pattern. Eli, he spoke once, and now the silence around him won't stop speaking back. Each thought you've had during this video, each twitch in your hand, each echo of a phrase you didn't intend to memorize was part of the writing. You didn't watch this. You were transcribed, and now the library grows by one more. Your mind has been added to its index. Your memory will carry the echo. Perhaps not now, perhaps not tomorrow, but someday, without meaning to, you'll repeat a phrase, draw a spiral, whisper a warning to someone you've never met, and they'll ask you where you heard it, and you won't remember, because that's how it survives. That's how it's always survived. One mind at a time, one sentence, one syllable, one accidental murmur in a dark room when no one else is listening, until someone hears, until someone writes it down, until someone like you joins the scribes of silence. And then, at the very end, when everything else has failed, there will still be the sentence, the one that opens the page and ends it, the sentence written across every death, every scream, every echo, the one you're thinking right now. Do not read aloud, but it's already too late, because if you've listened, you've remembered. And if you've remembered, you've already begun writing. It's not just a sentence, it's the first breath of the next chapter. And somewhere a blank book just opened its first page with your name written across the top.